This is Let's Talk Energy, your go-to podcast for smart energy insights. I'm your host, Noah Brenner, and each week we're giving you an inside look at the dynamics shaping global energy markets through in-depth interviews with our own Rystad energy experts, as well as some special guests. Now, in today's episode, we're taking a deep dive into the oil supply picture in South America. South America is poised to become one of the largest, if not the largest, source of new oil outside of the OPEC Plus producers group, as output growth from deepwater fields as well as shale will at least match, if not exceed, that of North America. That growth is being driven by a mix of favorable geology as well as effective policies that are keeping development costs highly competitive, even at oil prices lower than those today. At the same time, the continent remains an exploration destination, as national and international oil companies alike look to boost reserves to meet a future where oil demand looks increasingly resilient. So, how much additional oil could South America add to global markets in the next 5 years? And which countries will be driving that growth? Where are the exploration hotspots that we're watching that could become the continent's next giant fields? And how will South American countries and the companies working there maintain their output gains? And what are some wildcards that could push our forecasts up or down? To answer all this and more, I'm joined today from Oslo by Radhika Bansal, a vice president in Rystad Energy's analysis division and the leader of our coverage of South America's upstream sector. Radhika, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Noah.
Let's talk energy. Set the scene for us here quickly. I mean, your research shows that outside of the OPEC Plus producers group, South America is set to provide the largest or close to the largest amount of new oil to the market next year and really take on a leading position in the global supply growth over the next 5 years or so. So, break down the numbers for us. I mean, how much oil are we talking about here?
According to Rystad Energy's house view, the global liquids demand is supposed to peak in the early 2030s at around 107 million barrels per day. And it is supposed to stay at above 100 million barrels per day out to the 2040s, before it kind of declines to 75 million barrels per day by 2050. So now if we were to look at the supply side, the currently producing wells are expected to produce less than half of what they currently produce by the end of the decade, which basically means that there is a need for additional barrels in the market. And so we require more volumes for the underdevelopment and discovery lifecycle fields. Now, 60% of those conventional volumes are expected to come from the non-OPEC plus group. And then within the non OPEC plus group, we believe that South America is going to play an extremely critical role, basically growing by 560,000 barrels per day of crude oil and condensate volumes this year, followed by an additional 750,000 barrels per day of growth next year. And if we were to compare that with North America, we expect North America to grow by 275,000 barrels per day in 2026. So we are expecting really robust volumes, with South America expected to be leading in terms of year-on-year growth until the end of the decade. Whereas the US shale growth is expected to kind of slow down, an area which has been leading the non-OPEC plus supply growth so far.
Does this depend on high oil prices? What's the economic outlook of these barrels? Not all barrels are created equal, obviously.
It's not about high oil prices. It's about testing the competitiveness of these volumes at different oil price scenarios, and especially the low oil price scenarios. Especially in today's era, it's extremely important that we have advantaged barrels, which are going to be key for developing resilient portfolios in the market. We did run an analysis on the South American barrels, testing them at different oil prices. And it turns out that the South American barrels are actually extremely competitive at even $40 per barrel Brent price scenario. Obviously, at comparatively lower levels than what you would see in the base case. Basically, driven, like you rightly said, by their low cost deep water barrels. It shows relatively muted price sensitivity when you run these at lower oil prices. So basically, it generates a lot of confidence in the South American barrels actually making it to market between now and 2030 when it comes to the underdevelopment and discovery fields, even under a low oil price environment.
We've mentioned Brazil, we've mentioned Guyana. Which countries do we see kind of playing a leading role in this growth over the next few years?
Brazil, Guyana, they are going to be amongst the key producers in terms of deep water barrels. But we are also expecting the unconventional volumes from Argentina's Vaca Muerta shale play to play an incredibly important role moving forward. And then near to the end of the decade, we also see Suriname kind of coming up with its Grand Morgu development.
Which companies, I guess, are going to be playing a leading role here? I mean, obviously, we're dealing with some countries that have large and very capable national oil companies as well. This is an area that a lot of IOCs are interested in.
It's quite a good mix, I would say. Like in terms of NOCs, like be it Brazil's Petrobras, Ecopetrol in Colombia, or YPF in Argentina, they've been extremely key to kind of generating substantial revenues from the upstream sector and driving the national security and energy security. In terms of just percentage shares, if I were to talk about that, we see that NOCs, they currently contribute around 55% of the crude oil and condensate volumes in the region. But we expect that to kind of go down to about 50% by the end of the decade. And that's primarily because of the growing share of the majors and independents in South America. In terms of the majors, we've seen the likes of Shell, Total Energies, Exxon, Chevron play an extremely critical role in the region, supporting investments, the exploration efforts, bringing in the necessary expertise and infrastructure development, and really driving the growth in the countries where they're operating. So, if we were to look at the share of the majors on the other side, we see that kind of increasing from 15% currently to more than 20% by the end of the decade, with this increasing relevance in these three key countries of Brazil, Guyana, and Argentina.
Let's talk about Brazil because it's by far the largest producer in South America. What are we seeing in terms of Brazil's growth over the next couple of years, contributing to the volumes we've already talked about, and what's driving it?
The well productivity is extremely high. So, we are talking about an average of 20 to 25,000 barrels per day from a single well. And that can actually reach as high as 50 to 60,000 barrels per day of volumes per well at the peak. So it's basically the development, and these projects in Brazil are extremely cost competitive. And I think in Brazil, a lot of the robust production that we see today is attributed to this wave of sanctioning that we experienced back in 2015 to 19 period, which basically has put Brazil in the position that we see it as of now. It's been in this position of becoming a net exporter of crude oil over the last decade. And the continued ramp up of the deepwater projects in the country are going to keep it in that position for the next 15 years. We expect that the production is going to kind of decline post that. And that is why it is necessary to kind of focus a little bit on more exploration as well as enhanced recovery. As of now, the Brazil is the largest producer in South America, and its current production is at around a staggering 3.8 million barrels per day. It also has a robust pipeline of a lot of projects for this decade, and so we expect that it's going to be extremely strong in terms of production out till the 2030s.
Guyana, as many of our listeners already know, went from no oil production maybe a handful of years ago to more than 700,000, or around 700,000 barrels per day, following a string of massive discoveries by ExxonMobil. So, does Guyana's kind of meteoric growth continue, or do we see that country shifting maybe into a different phase of its development?
ExxonMobil made the first discovery in Guyana back in May 2015, and there has been no looking back for the country since then. However, like you rightly said, like we do see that there is this slowdown in the level of discoveries. with only 420 million barrels of liquid discoveries made over the past year, which is the lowest level since 2017. This underscores the necessity and the importance of continued exploration success in the country. Now, if we were to talk about the FPSOs and what is the pipeline, we have the Area Vito and the Jaguar FPSOs, which are scheduled to come online by 2027, and they are expected to increase the capacity by 500,000 barrels per day. And then along with the seventh and eighth developments in Guyana, which is Longtail and Hammerhead, which was recently approved, we expect the capacity to kind of increase to 1.7 million barrels per day. It's extremely great as to what ExxonMobil has been able to achieve so far. It's seen a lot of success and numerous discoveries, and it has rapidly brought them to development. We have around 4 FPSOs currently in production. We expect that the 2025 production on average is going to be above 700,000 barrels per day.
For those of you who aren't familiar, FPSO, it's floating production storage and offloading vessel. These are the large boats, essentially, that are actually producing the oil, storing it, and then putting it on tankers offshore. And so Guyana obviously has an immense amount of growth still in front of it, even if we do see perhaps a slowdown or at least a shift in emphasis from exploration towards development. But I want to talk about Argentina now. Argentina a bit unique here in that it's not a deep water story. It's an onshore story. It's a shale story. Much like what revolutionized oil production in the U.S. The Vaca Muerta shale play, it's been known for years. I remember it being talked about back when, say, the Permian Basin was still getting off the ground. But it's taken off recently. And so why is that? I guess what's changed for the play that has allowed it to kind of fulfill that potential that a lot of people have seen for a long time?
Vaca Muerta didn't change, but it's everything around it that has changed. And all of those changes have kind of supported and led to the expansion of Vaca Muerta. In fact, Vaca Muerta has not only reversed the decline in Argentina oil, but actually set the country on the path to surpass 1 million barrels per day of volumes by 2030 and actually just continue ramping even thereafter. There have been a lot of operational and regulatory changes in the country. So we see longer laterals being drilled, more productive wells, capital being reinjected, and a lot of the enhancement and takeaway capacity actually incentivizing producers to ramp up volumes. Also, importantly, we've seen a relatively more stable macroeconomic environment in the country, which has led to a more positive sentiment for the upstream industry, especially after the Milei government was elected. And more recently, the decisive win for President Milei in the midterm elections actually reinforces the pro-investment mandate. And it for Vaca Muerta, it creates a relatively stable and more predictive regulatory environment, like getting more visibility on the multi-year development plans. Also, I think back in 2014-18, because of the low oil prices, maybe there was low incentive. But now, after the COVID period, we've seen oil prices rise and more or less stabilize at around a $70 per barrel mark, which again incentivizes producers to ramp up and drill more. Another thing that I would like to highlight at this point is, just talk about the M&A activity in South America and how that has kind of reached historic highs this year after kind of, slowness in the activity that it experienced after the Petrobras halting its divestment model. And that's majorly been driven by Argentina, with basically international oil and gas companies reassessing their oil weighted portfolios in the country, the LNG developments, as well as YPF trying to divest out of its non-core conventional assets.
Does this develop like a US shale play? I mean, you sort of mentioned kind of ratable or predictable development plans, but that wasn't necessarily the case in the US. And so, do we see it being price responsive, I guess, like we've seen from other shale?
We've seen several changes over the last few years. It has evolved in a lot of respects, like longer laterals, more productive wells per foot. Although the drilling time is relatively longer if you still compare it with the Permian. Also, we do see some signs of maturity in some of the core or the more active blocks in Vaca Muerta, but we have a lot of the up and coming areas in the shale play which have a lot of remaining inventory yet to be drilled. Now, coming to your question in terms of price responsiveness, I would say there are a lot of similarities between the Permian and Vaca Muerta, just in terms of like the supply type. So they are both providing short cycle barrels. However, I think what we need to keep in mind for Argentina is it's difficult to get immediate responses in terms of the infrastructure requirements because then you require regulatory, national planning, regulatory approvals that need to be in place. And on top of that, if you add the layer of, the just the macroeconomic environment in terms of foreign exchange controls or capital repatriation controls or the inflation, etc., then I think it's just a bit more unstable when we compare it with the Permian. If we were to talk about also the operator mix, right? I think in Permian we see like a lot of big companies, independent players, whereas in Argentina it's still pretty much driven by the state-owned YPF. However, I think it's an important time to bring in the recent news that we just heard with the US headquartered Continental Energy actually kind of just acquiring a block in the northern part of the shale play, which signals to the immense confidence in the potential of the shale play and introduces a competitive dynamics in the basin.
We've been talking about crude oil really throughout the program here. Vaca Muerta, though, is not just a crude story, and so how important is gas to the development of the play, and is this associated gas from oil wells, or are players actually targeting the gas-prone parts of the shale?
It's important to emphasize that Vaca Muerta is not purely a crude oil story. It's well on its way to kind of monetize its vast gas reserves as well. And what we're seeing is that the rising natural gas volumes from Vaca Muerta is setting the stage for it to actually play an integral part in the global LNG market. So we see a lot of potential Argentina's Vaca Muerta shale play in terms of gas volumes actually expected to reach almost 8 billion cubic feet per day, by 2030, of which 6 billion cubic feet per day of gas volumes are going to be coming from Vaca Muerta. And then, in terms of the LNG development in Argentina, we already have the Southern Energy LNG project, which is a 6 million tons per annum capacity project. And the two trains, which are a part of that project, have already been green lighted and are expected to kick off in 2028. On the other hand, we also have YPF led Argentina LNG projects, and they've already managed to bring ENI and Shell as strategic partners for that development. And that's going to bring in an additional 18 million tons per annum of capacity. So, altogether, it's pretty big. We are looking at 24 million tons per annum of LNG from Argentina. And I think just this quarter, the other interesting development was ADNOC chiming in and wanting to join the party, I guess. It has already signed a non binding joint development agreement contract with ENI and ADNOC to be a part of the project.
I want to talk about Venezuela. It's a tough place to forecast for sure. There's a lack of data, and really the production is dictated by above ground risks. I mean, really U.S. sanctions and both the policy and the enforcement outlook. And now, most recently, we've seen this pretty major U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean that seems fairly obviously pointed towards Venezuela. Who knows how that will turn out? But what role does Venezuela play in the outlook that we've been talking about here?
We consider Venezuelan barrels as risk barrels just because of the extremely volatile geopolitical environment and, just the scenarios around sanctions. Basically, we believe that lack of demand and diluent are the major threats to the Venezuelan crude oil industry. On the demand side, however, we've seen China come out to be significant buyer for the Venezuelan crude volumes, and the actual number might be actually higher than what is being reported because of the involvement in the dark fleet trade. And the demand in China is basically, stemming from these small scale teapot refiners, which prefer to have these cheap Venezuelan crude barrels. Venezuela has been able to kind of maintain volumes despite the US sanctions being in place. Just in late July, also, Chevron was allowed to produce limited volumes from the country. And in January this year, we saw the country like crossing the 1 million barrel per day mark, which was 23% higher than the same month last year. And if we go by the OPEC reporting, we've seen that it produced 1.1 million barrels per day of crude oil volumes in October, which was about 25,000 barrels per day growth from what we've seen in September.
Mean, you mentioned scenarios. What are some of the possible scenarios as we're looking out into the future of production from the continent? How do we think about the scenarios of how Venezuela could unfold?
In terms of the base case, what we currently expect for Venezuela is to be producing at an average of slightly more than 1.1 million barrels per day this year. And then a 1.07 million barrels per day is what we look at for the next year. The demand and the diluent, which are the two most important things when you consider about or when you talk about, Venezuela crude oil potential. And we do have Russia, which is supplying naphtha to the country to, for blending purposes to make these volumes exportable. So there is this upside potential, room for an upside from that base case. But just looking at Chevron, which is like the largest company in terms of, private operator in the country, we see that if the license was to be revoked completely, then we are looking at a downside of about 70 to 80,000 barrels per day. But I would say, like in the long term, we see limited upside for the country, just because most of the fields are operated by PDVSA, which remains highly indebted. And we've seen like the approach which has been taken by the Maduro-led government for the oil industry, and we don't think there is going to be enough fiscal incentive or stability in the country to actually attract investors to stimulate the production growth.
South America's production, while it's going to quickly ramp up, will then face potentially a very quick decline, according to your analysis. I mean, without new discoveries, without proper management of existing fields, it's not going to be able to maintain that output, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Till 2030, we think that the supply is going to be able to meet demand if all of the underdevelopment and discovered resources were to be brought online. But it's post that we are kind of looking at a certain tightness in the supply and risk of supply shortage in the market in the absence of development of new resources, which basically means that there is a need to target more exploration in the deep water and frontier locations, including in South America, and to also basically do more infill drilling, enhance recovery, satellite tiebacks, enhance the total ultimate recoverable resources for the mature fields. And so is the case with South America. What we are seeing is that we expect the production of crude oil and condensate to peak for the region in the early 2030s. And if we are to kind of sustain the momentum in the country, in the region, we need to do two things, and that's we need to continue to target exploration and exploration success.
BP made headlines earlier this year with a discovery in Brazil called Boomerangue. BP was saying it's its biggest discovery in about 25 years. But there isn't a whole lot of information about it. And so, what is it that we do know about Boomerangue, and what's kind of Rystad's take on the potential for that development?
BP is expected to appraise and drill wells in 2027. It has a 100% share of this development, and it is known to be seeking partners to kind of farm into this alongside them while it continues to evaluate the potential. In terms of what we estimate, we are thinking about the discovery to have the potential of about 1.1 billion barrels of oil equivalent of resources. And that is just basis of analog data and the reservoir properties of the established pre-salt area. However, having said that, I think it's still early days. The success or the results of the appraisal are actually going to be critical to understand the true potential of the reservoir. What we've heard is that the CO2 content ranges between 20 to 30%, and the plan is to re inject 100% of the gas to maximize the well productivity and performance. And gas reinjection has been the strategy for the country, even in high CO2 fields like Mero in the past.
So I want to move from Brazil. I want to move north, up to Trinidad and Tobago, where we haven't seen drilling yet, but we saw really exciting news with ExxonMobil taking a massive block in the deep water, very lightly if explored at all. So, do we know what it is that Exxon is chasing? Obviously, are they trying to build on the success of Guyana? Is it something new? What can you tell me about this entry into Trinidad?
I think what they're really chasing is trying to replicate the exploration success that they saw in Guyana, having kind of recovered more than 13 billion barrels of recoverable resources. So they want to replicate that exploration model. The only difference this time around is that the probability of an oil discovery is far less, and it seems to be more of a gas play in the country. If there is a commercial success in terms of discovery, then I think it's going to be hugely beneficial for the country as well as the company. We expect that ExxonMobil is going to invest more than $20 billion if it moves in the right direction. And I think what we need to also keep in mind is that if it was to be a gas discovery, we also need to think about, the necessary infrastructure that needs to be created to kind of monetize that gas. But definitely for Trinidad, gas is something that they really need to kind of feed their LNG and petchem industry.
I know there are probably other places on the exploration radar, but I want to jump and talk a little bit about brownfield development. I mean, the second part of your recommendation for maintaining production was making sure that companies are taking care of the fields. Kind of looking to see what else they can wring from these existing discoveries. And so, I guess, what's the size of the prize? How important could increased recovery be to South America's production profile? And what needs to be done? What types of activities could unlock it?
While we understand that exploration is the only way to really get like the truly large volumes, but then of course it is long cycle, and there is geological and commercial risk that is involved with those. And so when we talk about brownfield activity, that is low cycle, low risk and low cost, I think it can act as a complementary strategy to exploration, wherein you stabilize production in the short to medium term while you kind of evolve the new exploration barrels. When we talk about Brazil, it is expected to touch its peak in the early 2030s, and it's expected to decline as quick as it had ramped up. Brownfield activity and enhanced recovery plays an extremely critical role in that. So we did an analysis wherein we basically took, the top 20 fields, top 10 operated by Petrobras and another top 10 by other operators in the country, basically by the original oil in place. And then we saw that the average recovery on these fields, which is nothing but, your economically recoverable barrels as a percentage of the in place reserves, stands at around 26%. And if we were to, tune that up from 26 currently to 33%, we are able to extend the plateau by about 10 years and prevent that immediate decline that we expect at the moment. So basically, it requires a 7 percentage point to unlock 11 billion barrels of volumes from the country and mitigate that decline. Similarly, I think in Colombia, which again is a country where we expect that the volumes are going to decline soon enough, if no more discoveries are made, if there we were to think about increasing recovery rates to 8%, then I think we are able to sustain the volumes at least in the short to medium term.
I wanted to talk a little bit about look, we're taping this as COP 30 is wrapping up in Brazil, and there's been a focus, of course, then on what the host country Brazil is doing in its own climate policy, and I'll be honest, more than a little bit of criticism of some of the countries that we've talked about that are increasing production. But I mean, it's not like these governments are ignoring climate. Brazil is in the top 10 of Rystad Energy's decarbonization index. Guyana is certified as carbon neutral. Suriname is one of just a handful, I think, 2 or 3 countries that are carbon negative. This is due to the forests that they have that are taking in carbon. Um, and so, I guess, are these examples of this pragmatic approach to climate that we've seen emerge this year and really kind of take center stage at COP?
I think a majority of the countries in South America are really focused on development of low carbon barrels, protecting the natural carbon sinks, and kind of diverting, the revenues from the hydrocarbon industry into their decarbonization efforts. Like the case, for example, Brazil, right? I mean, if you look at it's got one of the cleanest electricity grids, with 90% of that being sourced from renewable sources. One of the major producers of low carbon bioethanol. They're making efforts in both directions, so it's not like they've lost sight of the climate change. They are indeed taking a pragmatic approach to development of fossil fuels. If we were to just look at the upstream scope 1 and 2 emissions intensity for Brazil, it's actually just shy of the global average of 18 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. The continued ramp up of the ultra deep water barrels closer to 2030, we expect actually that level to dip even further below 15 kg of CO2 per barrel. And that's been possible because of modern platforms using gas and power generation and limited flaring. Just this year, we had FPSO Mira Kiteria on the Jubarte field, the first to be using a fully electric combined cycle gas turbine system. On the other hand, we have in our neighboring Colombia, President Petro having a completely different approach to the industry, wherein he's kind of banned any kind of new oil and gas licensing activity, increased taxes on the fossil fuel companies, and then he's trying to develop this economy on tourism and agriculture. If the country is to eventually be in a position where it has to import oil from elsewhere, that, in my opinion, is not coming without the cost of carbon emissions. We can kind of be more pragmatic about it. There shouldn't be a contradiction between responsible development of oil and gas versus our pledge towards climate change. As long as there is demand, I think we should be working and focusing on getting the advantaged, low carbon, cost competitive barrels into the market. And I think South America is extremely well placed to provide that.
Well, and as we and others increasingly see, that demand isn't going anywhere anytime soon, or at least not declining very rapidly. And so South America steps in to meet it. Well, Radhika, thank you so much for joining us on the program. It's a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much, Noah.
Let's recap. South America's rising oil and gas production will be one of the most important contributors to global supply growth through 2030. Brazil, Argentina, and Guyana will be the main drivers of that growth, with Suriname joining the group later on this decade, while Venezuela remains a wildcard, despite its large reserves, due to political uncertainty. While decline rates will test the ability of South American producers to maintain their output highs, exploration, alongside improved recovery factors, offer avenues to unlock additional volumes. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Energy. This podcast is a production of Rystad Energy, produced by Laura Rodriguez-Skaug and Boda Oak. Check out the show notes for further analysis of the topics we've discussed today, and connect with us on social media. We're at Rystad Energy on all your major platforms. While you're there, leave us a review, click that like button, and subscribe. You can also keep up to date on our website. If you'd like to send us a question or maybe reflect on today's show, perhaps suggest a topic for another episode, email us directly. It's podcast@rystadenergy.com. And most importantly, don't forget to join us next week for more Let's Talk Energy.